Yes， 哎，我在。我们开始了吗 ？OK。稍等我一下。
任迪先生好。好，
哎，
我看你挺
白老
好的。
师你好，你好，谢谢你，刚才谢谢你，不但是精彩的讲座，我认为你是好学者的典范。你研究那个经坡语已经有60年，你还那么谦虚，还是那么虚心。我做研究还是报告，我觉得这非常难得。你真是我的我的偶像。
谢谢。因为对一个语言的认识很不容易啊。哎，好，我听你的报告，听你的报告啊。谢谢你啊。对。
The second keynote session, our first speaker is Professor Randy LaPolla from Nanyang Technological University and Beijing Normal University, Zhuhai. The topic of this talk is the Chinese expansion and language coexistence in modern China. 这一节的主题演讲，第一位主讲人是新加坡南洋理工大学暨北京师范大学珠海分校的罗仁弟教授。他的论文题目，中文的意思大致是汉语的扩张以及当代中国的语言共存。Let's welcome Professor LaPolla.
谢谢林老师。因为这个是国际会议，我今天选择用英语讲。如果到了那个问答的时候，大家要用汉语提问的就没问题了。好，那我先用英语讲。Okay, first I'd like to thank Huang Yang 老师 and Professor Huang Yang and the other organizers of the conference, not only for inviting me, but for putting so much effort into this conference. It's really been a tough struggle for them with all of the sudden changes because of the pandemic and other things. And so I really appreciate all the effort they've put into organizing this conference. Okay, today I'm returning to a topic I published on 15 years ago, how the migrations of the Sino-Tibetan speakers have affected the development of the Sino-Tibetan language family. I want to update it a bit, though, on using recent work by South Coblin and a number of other scholars, such as Shen Ruiqing, Zhuang Chusheng, Guo Bichi, and others, who are now using empirical data in the comparative method, pretty much in the tradition of Jerry Norman, to understand the development of the varieties of Sinitic, isolating out the historical strata and matching the findings with migrations and other events in history. As I argued back in 2001, you cannot understand the history of the languages unless you understand the history of the speakers. And what we find when we work empirically is not a clean Stammbaum or family tree, but a much more complex history. So the first thing is the title of this talk, I've changed it a little bit, but I'm going to talk about the first half of it, the Chinese expansion and diffusion. The title of this talk might make it seem as if there's been some unified and unchanging group that we can call the Chinese that simply expanded over time. But this is not the case. The concept of Chinese is a socio-political construct which, in terms of genetics, ethnicity, culture, and language, has constantly been in flux due to migrations and the mixing of peoples and cultures. And of course, language is culture. So that's part of what's been going on. Now, there were waves of different humanoid migrations out of Africa as early as 2 million years ago, and intermixing of different species of humanoids, such that human migrations have led to mixed genetic material among different humanoid populations. Now, modern human migrations into Asia seem to have been from the Southwest over a period of 60 to 18,000 years ago. But that's actually not so relevant to what we're talking about, which is languages, which is we can really only go back to around 8 or 10,000 years when we're talking about languages. We can look at archaeology, you can look at genetics, but they can't really tell you because the genes don't speak languages, and the potsherd can't tell you what a paradigm is. So there's really little we can get from that except collaborating, the collaborating evidence. Now, the origins of what we call the Chinese and the Sino-Tibetans generally are said to have been in the Yellow River Valley of the Central Plains of what is now North China around 6,000 years ago, as represented in the Neolithic Yangshao culture. At that time, there were already other cultures to the east and south in what we now think of as China. And even before the migrations east and south from the Central Plains, there may have been contact between different areas. So this is from Zhang Guangzhi, his idea of initial China, where you had about 6,000 BCE, you had several different cultures, and they were not isolated from each other. There was contact, as far as we know, among these different groups. To the north of the Central Plains, you had, in historic times at least, we have peoples from the Altaic Mountains in the northern steppes who spoke languages ancestral to the Altaic languages like Uyghur, Mongolian, and Manchu. To the south, starting around the Yangtze River, were speakers of Hongmian or Miaoyao and Tai Kadai or Zhuangdong Kradai languages. And to the east and southeast, some people argue they were Austroasiatic languages and precursors of the Austronesian languages. I recently had some discussions with Mark Alves, who's a Vedic specialist, and he kind of doubts he's been looking a lot at archaeology and doubts that the idea that Austroasiatic people lived that far north is problematic. He thinks they were further south. But anyway, so that's still an open question, but it is something that a number of people have proposed. So let's look at the distribution of the modern dialects. So here we see there's great diversity in the southern dialects and less diversity within Mandarin spread over a large period, and some of it is even cut off on the right-hand side there. So what I want to point out with these maps is that there's an overlap with the Hmong-Mien languages in the south. As you can see here, the distribution of Hmong and Mianic, or Miao and Yao. But this is the current distribution. In the past, there would have been even more of this. And also, also the Tai Kadai languages or Zhuangdong languages, which again, this is the modern distribution, but they would have been more widely spread in the past. So when people from the north came down, all of the southern dialects, of course, come from the north at some point, or they were the result of migrations from the north or spread of the culture from the north. Both of those things can lead to language change. So there was necessarily contact in these groups. Even within the Central Plains, there were differences in identity and language, and there was contact between the different groups in the early period, to the extent that the ancestors of some early Chinese rulers are said to have been from the Western group associated with the modern Tibeto-Burman peoples. Now, migrations from the middle reaches of the Yellow River, we associate with the Chinese, mainly followed three routes: east, south, and southeasterly. This map the arrows aren't exactly right, but that's the best I could do. So they were in the middle reaches of the Yellow River and moved to the east into the Central Plains, and then more northern area of the Central Plains, and then also down into the south at different times and in different waves. The people who stayed in the Central Plains and those who moved east and southeasterly, we identify as the Chinese. There were also migrations to the west and southwest. And those who moved west and then south through the Tibetan Plateau and into Nepal and Bhutan, we identify as the Bodish branch of Tibeto-Burman, which is Tibetan and closely related groups. And those who went southwesterly along the eastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau down the river valleys, we identify as the rest of the Tibeto-Burman peoples. Now, these migrations occurred in waves of movement of different sizes, often different areas, and for different reasons. So now, speaking only of the Chinese, what we think of as the Chinese now, as early as the Yin Dynasty, quite a few years ago, the government encouraged or forced migrations, including shifts of national or regional capitals. And all Chinese governments up to the present one have used this tactic to relieve population pressures and solidify borders. There have also been massive migrations due to natural disasters, war, and the pull of economic opportunities. I want to emphasize there's a very good book, the Wu and Cao, 1997, which is a multi-volume series of all the migrations in China, because the history of China has been one of migrations. Every time there's a war, every time there's a dynasty change, every time there's a natural disaster, there's huge migrations. And when I say huge, people find it hard to imagine millions of people moving together. I mean, of course, they don't really move all together. It's not like they all get on the same bus, but this is something that I've been wrongly criticized for saying, but I don't say that. It takes sometimes hundreds of years for these massive movements to happen, but they do happen, and it's happened over and over and over again in Chinese history. And I'm only going to talk about a couple of the major ones here and their influence, but there's been so many of them up to even in like the Ming Dynasty, you had 11 million people moving, being forced to move by the government in one migration. So these were massive migrations that happened over and over again. Now, a significant fact is that the movements were almost never into an area where there were no people. That meant migration not only involves splitting a group of speakers into two or more subgroups, which can lead to differentiation of the speech varieties over time. It almost always meant there was cultural and language contact and coalescence, either with speakers of other Sinitic varieties, sometimes even closely related varieties, but sometimes more distantly related varieties, or of non-Sinitic languages. There were, of course, as I just showed, there were non-Sinitic peoples living all around the original so-called Chinese. And so wherever they went, basically, they ran into other speakers. And in many of the government-sponsored migrations, there was purposeful mixing of people from different areas to avoid the development of power bases. This led to either the absorption of other peoples into what we now think of as the Han Chinese ethnic group, or in some cases, the absorption of the immigrants by the local ethnic groups. So, for example, the soldiers and settlers sent to the Southwest, some of the Yuan Dynasty soldiers and settlers sent to the Southwest during that period, the Yuan Dynasty, were absorbed into the Yi culture and developed a new Yi language now called Gazhuo, which Dai Lao Shi has talked about. And in the north, for example, you had different groups of Altaic speakers which controlled large parts of northern China for hundreds of years each, or a millennium. So different ethnic groups, but at different times controlling large areas of North China, so much so that Beijing was a political center of non-Han rulers for most of the 1,000 years before the 20th century, except for 300 years during the Ming Dynasty. Now, these groups eventually, assimilated into Han culture, but also had an influence on the development of Han culture. And in fact, even the clothes we think of now it's traditionally Chinese clothes. It's really the Manchu outfit, but this is taken to be Chinese clothes now. So you can see how these things have just been assimilated without really any difficulties. So the influence of the northern cultures on the northern variety of Chinese is most pronounced, while the southern varieties maintain some of the older features of older Chinese more completely than northern Chinese does, but they also manifest features similar to those in the Dai Kadai and Hmong-Mien languages. A lot of this work has been done by was originally done by Hashimoto, one of the people who first started looking at migrations and using the wave theory to look at dispersal and the language patterns in Chinese. And there's still a group of Japanese scholars, his former students, like Endo Yuantang, Professor Yuantang, Professor Endo, who is continuing this work in Japan. One of the major changes in the demographic situation that led to the relatively recent rapid and widespread dispersal of the northern variety, which we saw in the map, how the Mandarin variety seems to be such a major part of the Chinese landscape. But this is really a very recent phenomenon because if we look at the map here, these migrations out of the central area to the northeast, the west, and the southwest of what is now China, these are relatively recent. In the 17th century, only 1/20th of the population of China lived in the northeast, southwest, and upper Yangtze areas, representing about 10% of the population of northern variety speakers. But massive migrations west and southwest from the middle Yangtze area and northeast from the central plains led to these areas now being home to 1/3 of China's population and half of the total population of the northern variety speakers. These migrations made Mandarin the dominant variety in China, such that it was chosen to be the base of the national language in the early 20th century. There was, of course, controversy at the time as to which language to choose, and it was largely because Mandarin was so widespread that by that time, although it was a relatively recent spread, they chose that language. At the same time, contact varieties of Chinese, which show features of Tibeto-Burman or Altaic languages, have also arisen in the western areas, such as the Sinitic variety spoken by Dongan people of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, Yabutun, Lingxia dialect of Chinese. You have Atsuo has been working on a sort of mixed language as well, like Daohua. So these kind of things are developing in these are more recent contact varieties that are developing. Okay, so now I want to get to the kind of heart of it. That was really just background of the fact that migrations are an important part of the development of the family generally, but now I just want to talk about the origins of the Sinitic varieties, how Chinese kind of became to be the way it is. Now, because this is only a short talk, I'm only going to be able to talk about a couple of dialects, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about Jiangdong, but mainly about Kejia, Gan, and Min, because these have been very well researched by South Coblin and Jerry Norman and others. And so we're starting to really get a clear idea, because as I said, they're using a very different methodology now. They're not basing it on rhyme books and imagined Middle Chinese and problematic assumptions about where the dialects came from. They're just basing it on natural data and using the comparative method. And South has a really wonderful book called Comparative Gan. It came out in 2015, and then another book on comparative Hakka Shi in 2018. And then he has a new book on comparative Shi that's coming out soon. And he also has some very good work on Min, but in articles. Mainly, he's building on work by Jerry Norman, who first came up with this idea of using traditional methods to understand the dialects. Because, well, anyway, I'll come back to this later. So the mixing of speakers of different languages that resulted from the many migrations is what's given us the branches or topolex of Sinitic that we now find. Topolex is a better translation for Fangyan than dialect. There was an early Jiangdong branch that had formed from an Eastern Zhou dynasty southern migration roughly 2,500 years ago. And as I said, it may have been Austroasiatic speaking area. There certainly were people there who spoke some language that wasn't Sinitic. whether it was Zhuangdong or whether it was Austroasiatic or whether it was something else, we're not 100% sure. But certainly there was something there, the Minyue or Baiyue. A major change occurred in that area after the fall of the Western Jin dynasty. So this was one of the, I'm going to talk about three major migrations here. The first one is this fall of the Western Jin dynasty in 316, when you had 2 million of the northern steppes people moving into the central plains when they took control, causing 3 million of the original Central Plains inhabitants to flee to the southeast into the Jiangxi, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu area. In Chinese, this is called Yongjia Zhiluan. These included the former aristocracy of Jin, plus, as Coblin points out, a large number of other migrants from Shandong and northern Jiangsu, as well as Henan, Hebei, Shanxi, and Shanxi. Now, a second, I'll show you a map in a minute of these three migrations, but I'll first describe the migrations. A second major migration wave, beginning with the Anlushan Rebellion, or Anshi Zhiluan, in the 8th century and up to the mid-10th century, led to more northern migration into this area. This led to a change in the area to a more northern type of Sinitic variety in those areas. And a third major wave of migration of about 5 million immigrants occurred after the fall of the northern Song dynasty in the early 12th century that affected much of the south, as again, the northern peoples took over in northern part of China. And so in this map, I'm going to show you in this map, the solid lines represent the first wave, the dashed lines represent the second wave, and the dotted lines represent the third wave. So it wasn't like a very neat, everybody, okay, let's go march down there or something like that. It was scrambling to get out of the way of the oncoming Jurchens and whatnot in each of the, whoever it was that was coming down. And again, there were other migrations as well, but I'm just talking about these three, which were generally due to some kind of war or dynasty change or change of ownership of the land in the north. And so this affected the speech in the different areas. So I just want to talk about this a little bit. Okay, so first we talk about Gan, Hakka, and Shi, which are related. The Gan and Hakka branches form from migrations into central and northern Jiangxi. The first major branch, first major northern migration into the central southern area, that is what the area I'm talking about, the Jiangxi area, began when the first emperor sent 500,000 troops and settlers south of the Yangtze into the in the 3rd century BC. Now he split it into 5 armies, and about one of those armies, 100,000 troops or so, went through this area, this branch that the army and settlers, they moved through the Poyang Lake area into the Gan River watershed, and an area where the Wu and Chu, the original Wu and Chu countries, kind of overlapped. And a part of that army, of course, settled in the lower areas of the Gan River flows north, because the southern part of Jiangxi is highlands, and the northern part is lowlands, and the river comes down towards Poyang Lake and empties into Poyang Lake. And so, but they followed the river up into the highlands. Part of them moved further up. A part of that settled in the lower lands, but part of it moved into the higher lands, into the south central highlands that cover parts of southern Jiangxi, western Fujian, northeastern Guangdong, and west into the southeastern corner of Hunan. And they set up garrisons there, and in those days they would settle people there. It wasn't just you go there, take over, and come back. They would settle people there. The garrison settlements continued through the Han period, and there was a gradual increase in Sinitic speakers into the area, particularly of non-military settlers in both the lower and higher areas. Coblin calls the variety of Chinese that formed in the northern variety, formed from the northern varieties of Chinese brought into the Gan area during that period, early South Central Chinese. He posits 2 subtypes of this early South Central Chinese. one spoken in the northern lowlands, which became what we now think of as the Gan variety, and one spoken in the southern highlands, which developed into what we think of as the Hakka varieties. And I say varieties here because we now distinguish kind of Xin Hakka, or what he calls Neo Hakka, from Lao Hakka, which is like he calls Paleo Hakka. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, there were already non-Sinitic people living in the highlands, including as a major part would have been identified as ancestral Shi people, which Coblin distinguishes from the modern Shi ethnic group, which has changed its language. We aren't sure what their original language was, although Sagart and Nakanishi both argue it was a Hongmian language, one arguing it's Mianish, one arguing it's Hmongish. But it seems they switched to speaking an early version of South Central Highland Chinese, the language that gave rise to this Lao Kejia or Paleo Hakka, Neo Hakka, and modern Shi at that time. This early South Central Highland variety was already the result of contact between earlier and later settlers, but then migration through the Poyang region and further south up the Gan River increased after the Anlushan rebellion of the 8th century and continued through the fall of the Tang dynasty and into the mid-10th century. A second major wave of migration from the north into Jiangxi occurred after the fall of the Northern Song dynasty in the 12th century and the push by the Jurchen south. In the ensuing several hundred years, there was a blending of the different cultural and linguistic strata. You had the early Aboriginal strata, the early Central Highland strata, post-Anlushan rebellion strata, the post-Northern Song collapse strata, and all of these formed into a single complex Sinitic language variety and culture, which Coblin calls New South Central Highlands Chinese. And here's a map of the area. The orange part is the Hakka, what has been called by Leung, the Hakka heartland. And then within that, there is the olive-colored area here, which is the seen as the ancestral Shi settlement area. This map is from Coblin's book. From the early 16th century until the mid-17th century, there was economic expansion in the lower areas that attracted migrants from the highlands. As these highlanders had their own language and culture, they were seen as strangers and called Hakka. And they did census. They actually had early census at that time, and they would distinguish local people from what they called Kemin or Keren. And so it was really not meant to be a specific ethnic group. It was just people who were not locals. And so Coblin argues that the concept was not just Coblin, but others, Leung and others, have argued that the concept of Hakka, recognizing themselves as Hakka, is a much later phenomenon. But initially, they were just kind of like itinerant workers for the other people living in the lower altitudes. Now, those who stayed in the highlands were not called by this name until modern linguists started doing so, because again, they were not, in the census, was not counted as Keren. But with later economic downturns and conflict between the lowland people and those who they called Hakka, the latter, that is the Hakka people, continued to migrate further afield as far as Sichuan. And I think this is well known. I'm not going to go into those. The Shi also at around this time continued to conflict due to conflict with the Sinitic settlers in the highlands, because the highlands were getting a bit crowded and they had different concepts of land ownership, whereas the Shi were kind of slash and burn agriculturists, and the Chinese, of course, wanted to just control land, so they eventually came into conflict. So some of them also left for the economic opportunities in the lowlands, some together with what were called the Hakka later, and some on their own paths southeastward into Guangdong and Fujian, and in some cases up the coast into Zhejiang. while they often kept to themselves, they did interact with the Han Chinese and picked up linguistic influences they did, or in some cases, fully assimilated. Excuse me. Okay, now turning to Min. I think I'm going a little too fast, so if anybody wants me to slow down or anything, I'm not sure, because we started early, I'm not sure exactly when I'm supposed to finish, but and I'll just, Lin Laoshi said she's going to give me a notice.
There are actually 10 minutes to go. So.
10 minutes to go, okay, good, that's just about right. Okay, so with Min, until the end of the Eastern Han Dynasty, there was no appreciable Sinitic population of what is now the Min area. Currently, the Min branch manifests many strata, and in fact, as Coblin argues, based on ideas first put forward by Jerry Norman, it manifests the results of not fully completed convergence of 3 or more unnameable pre-Min varieties, not Min varieties, but pre-Min Sinitic varieties. So one stratum is the language of what were called the Minyue, of course, the people who originally were in the area. And the Sinitic strata can be linked to migrations of different times and from different places. So one is the language of the first Chinese settlers during the latter part of the Eastern Han Dynasty, basically the beginning of the 3rd century AD, who entered the northwestern part of Fujian from the southwest and central parts of Zhejiang, which is the reason why I talked about Jiangdong area, because they came from this Jiangdong area, which is not Wu as we think of it today, but it was an earlier kind of version, and which had been populated by migrants from the areas just north of that area, such as Henan, Shandong, Jiangsu, and Anhui at the end of the 2nd century. So that area itself was only populated by the 2nd century CE, that lower part of Jiangsu. Somewhat later, there was migration from Jiangxi in the west into northern Fujian, and the 2 sets of migrants converged in that area. A separate migration from the north, which began at the end of the 3rd century of the current era, was by sea down along the coast, possibly by Sinicized Yue or Dong O or O people, who were known to be good sailors. Coblin summarizes these 3 migrations in the following map. So if you look at the yellow is the migrations from southwestern Zhejiang down into Fujian. The orange, or what looks to me more like red, were the migrations from eastern Jiangxi into far western Fujian. And the purple along the coast is the coastal migrations from the Wenzhou area down to the eastern part of Fujian. Now, Coblin suggests the western and coastal migrations developed into 2 different linguistic varieties, what he called pre-Min B and pre-Min A, respectively, which later converged around 300 of the current era to give us common Min, the initial ancestor of the modern Min variety. So he's saying that Min as Min only really came together around 300 AD or early 4th century. The first language we can call Min is this one. But given the differences between inland and coastal Min, he also argues that the inability to reconstruct a single common Min form for many lexical items and all the current differences among the different, the coastal versus inland Min, he suggests that the convergence is not fully complete. There were also, of course, large migrations due to the Anlushan rebellion and the Tang dynasty and the literary form of the Tang Kone that affected language. So these end up as strata in the language. And Fujian was also affected by migrations after the fall of the Song dynasty in the 12th century, another layer. And so now there's also influence from modern Mandarin. So there are 2 important conclusions we can make from looking at the history of migrations and language development in the Min area. One is, as the Min branch is not reflected in the 601 AD rhyme book Qie Yun, it's often assumed that that branch is an earlier split off from the rest of Chinese. But it may actually be that the branch had not yet fully formed as a distinct entity, or was simply not something the writers of the Qie Yun were aware of or cared about, because it really as the area was not fully integrated into the intellectual life of China at the time, the way the old capitals were and things like that. This may be why in Min, when you're speaking Min, the people call themselves Tang people, Donglang, and instead of Han people, Hanren, and they call China Dengsuan, Tang Mountain instead of Zhongguo. When people write about the different Sinitic varieties, it's common for them to refer to a family tree, such as the following. This is from Zev Handel's work, but this is just a standard kind of thing. And it's based on a supposition by Coblin that because there are some older elements in Min and it didn't fit with the rest of his philological interpretation of the Jie Yun rhyme categories, he assumed it must have branched off early. But what I'm arguing is this is unrealistic. And this, I'm not alone in this. I'm also following Jerry Norman and South Coblin in this. And this idea that Middle Chinese is the origin of all of the modern dialects is also quite unrealistic. So following Jerry Norman and South Coblin, I want to argue that this is not the way we should be looking at the dialects. They dismiss Colgrin's idea that all of the Sinitic varieties except Min arose out of his philological interpretation of the Jie Yun rhyme book, and instead work from data of the spoken modern dialects and use the comparative method to reconstruct empirically based earlier stages of the different groups. For those who want to understand the method or think Chinese can't be analyzed using a comparative method, Coblin has a wonderful article that's supposed to come out in the bulletin, or hopefully will come out in the Bulletin of Chinese Linguistics later this year or next year. The Jerry and South also do not see neat family trees coming out of their work, just as we see biologists now accept the idea that hybridization is not something unusual in evolution and the creation of new species, but is instead a regular feature of evolution, either as combinatorial speciation or introgressive hybridization. And so instead of neat family trees, they're using web-like images to represent relationships. We need to understand languages are also not easily represented by such trees, as they are more or less the result of coalescence, contact, and influence. So I'm going to leave you here with my last slide is a quote from Coblin. It says, our view here is that demographic history suggests waves and flowage rather than discrete branches which have diverged and developed independently according to a tree-type model. And in particular, he's talking about the relationship of Gan and Hakka, and he says it's kind of pointless to try to draw clear lines between Gan and Hakka. He says the configuration of this type is not inherently susceptible to absolute demarcations, nor is it easily characterizable in terms of a distinct set of shared innovations in separate branches of a tree. This is because it's produced by fluid demographic dynamics rather than by neat Stammbaum type bifurcations. These families are related by the fact that they have been subject to the same demographic processes, but that they differ in the manners in which they have been influenced by these processes. Okay, thank you very much. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you, Randy, for this. I'm here. Yeah, thank you for this presentation. It was really wonderful. Now the floor is open for questions and comments. 现在可以可以提问，也可以就是提出各位的这个意见，可以是英语的，也可以是中文的。
Hello, Randy.
Hi, Jesse. I expected you to be the first one. You're always the first one when I give a talk.
Well, it was a great talk, and
thank you.
I don't, I haven't studied the Hakka migrations and all of that before, so it was a great overview, and I'm looking forward to reading the paper and also looking at the references. But I would just like to ask, I think in general, I think you're right, like the tree model, it's not perfect. It has its problems. We need to think about ways to model and represent the changes that have happened over time. But at the same time, there is a lot of merit, I think, with the tree model that we should also consider keeping. And I think an example of that, like you said, from evolutionary biology, you know, we can say, yeah, we need to have more complex models, and I think that's true. But at the same time, it's very useful and very, I think, accurate to be able to draw like a tree, for example, of humankind and primates and hominids, and show the branches, even though they might not be exactly clean branches. I think there's still a usefulness for having kind of a basic model for some of these things, and maybe to draw some lines within the trees. So anyways, I just was wondering what your comments would be about that.
Yeah, certainly. No, I'm not saying you can't use trees at all, but they just look more like bushes than they look like trees, possibly, because there's so much interaction. And this is what they're doing. Like if you look at human genetic development trees, it's not a neat, like kind of bifurcation type tree. You've got all kinds of things influencing each other because there was genetic mixing. So we have these different solid lines and dotted lines and all these other things. When I should have brought up one of those images, because I was looking at one just before when I was making this slides. I should have included that. But so this is where I got the idea. But also, you know, going back to Welland theory, you know, like the wave theory, with Mantaro was a big influence on me, I guess, and Mantaro Hashimoto, in terms of thinking in terms of ways of migration, waves of change, and you know, having a center of innovation, and then the outer edges. The way he talked about it was the outer edges, kind of preserving some of the older features, like we see, because they're less affected by some of the more internal changes, the changes that happen more towards the center of those changes. But so there's all of these things have to be taken into account. But I guess what I was trying to say is the tree that I showed you in the slide, where it's assumed that there was a clear break between Old Chinese and Min and the rest of Chinese, and then there was Qieyun, all of a sudden this one language, even though we know for a fact that there were lots of languages spoken at the time, that somehow they all disappeared and it was only the Qieyun, and all of the modern dialects come out of the Qieyun. This is all unrealistic. And if you read the preface to the Qieyun, it's also, you know, you would know that it's not meant to represent a single language. It isn't a language. It's just a philological interpretation of character readings. And this is really what Coblin was interested in, was character readings. And so to take his philological interpretation of these character readings as a language, as he argued, Tang Dynasty Koine or something, when this was actually written before the Tang Dynasty even, all of that is just so problematic, I think. So it's that aspect of the tree. I'm not saying you can't ever use a tree. I'm just saying that this particular tree that a lot of people accept as the basis of understanding how Chinese varieties work, because Coblin really wasn't interested in determining the dialects. He was interested in understanding the readings of the characters, and so that's why when I edited that 4-volume set on Sino-Tibetan linguistics, of classic papers in Sino-Tibetan linguistics, I included his work on characters, but not his work on phonetics, because I just don't think it's been helpful.
Is there any other comments or questions? Check.
Yeah, Yojing, I'll jump in if you don't mind.
Go ahead,
Randy, thank you. Thank you for an eye-opening talk. I've not been following all of these arguments. It's very interesting. I have a more general question. So obviously the Sinitic languages are famous for a very analytic morphosyntactic structure. And in other places around the world, we see that resulting from extensive language contact, where non-native speakers are adopting new languages and they get simplified. Do you think that, yeah, exactly. So do you think that this is part of what's happened in the Sinitic languages, is that all these migrations and language contact situations have led to simplification, or is the simplification driven by something else completely?
Well, I mean, it's been somewhat, isolating going way back. I mean, there was lexical morphology, that we have reconstructed, such as causative marking, prefix, causative prefix, that's for all of Sino-Tibetan, the S prefix and whatnot. But on the morphosyntactic level, it's as far back as we can really say clearly, it's been relatively isolating. So I know some people say that it's because Chinese is a widely used language, it has been simplified. And actually, somebody like Sadikoko Mofweni would argue that that happens to all languages that are widely spread. But because it's basically, it goes back to what Trudgill talks about, I guess, is that second language learners simplify languages, whereas children don't worry about complexity. They can learn complexity. Adults are dumb. They can't handle complexity. So they simplify things. Now, it's because they have their own habits. And so it's more difficult to acquire different habits, whereas children don't have any habits, so they can acquire anything without any difficulty. But anyway, but yeah, it's possible that some of the simplification was due to that, certainly we know that non-native speakers speaking Chinese did lead to certain things. So we have very clear Altaic influence, where you had Altaic speakers speaking Chinese and then making Mandarin look more like, or making Northern variety look more like Altaic languages than Southern languages, which have maintained, for example, like Cantonese maintains the final stops, and certain things like that. So there's certainly something about that in terms of general effects, whether or not the morphosyntactic meanings. I mean, Humboldt, in analyzing Chinese, was very impressed by the logical straightforwardness of classical Chinese, the isolating nature of it, and how brilliantly that just straightly reflected the logic of the thinking. He was very, very much a fan of Old Chinese, wrote some very good stuff on it. So I think, we also don't really know that much about the really older levels of Chinese, because everything, as South Coblin has talked about, there's what we call he calls a Han horizon. The only thing we can really be relatively certain about is all the stuff that came to us since the Han Dynasty. And we have empirical data about pronunciations and about forms and stuff starting with the Han Dynasty, because we don't know the whole very, very well about what happened before that. So that's why most of his work is from the Han Dynasty on up to the present, rather than doing a lot of speculative work, pre-Han stuff. So we really don't know that much certainty about the earlier part, but certainly from the texts that were given to us from that period, they still seem relatively isolating.
Thank you.
Okay. I got a question myself, actually, because that could be. I was actually wondering. I was actually wondering whether the concept of creolization would ever fit into the picture, because I noticed that the term is never brought up in the related discussions. And is there any reason why people don't use it, or actually, in fact, the notion of creolization is not incompatible with these idea of coalescence, contact, and so on in Coblin's and your discussion?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. This is something that Sadikoko Mofweni has argued, that it's pointless to talk about one language being a Creole and another language not being a Creole, because all languages are subject, just like to some extent what Coblin is saying, although I don't think he's aware of Sally's work. But almost all languages are subject to these contact influences and some level of what you might call creolization or whatever, where people are multilingual. You've been in areas where people are multilingual, and you know what it's like, where everybody's speaking the same languages, and then there's cultural convergence. You have all kinds of cultural manifestations, and so convergence of these ways of thinking, ways of speaking, which is a form of creolization in a sense. And then that gets passed on. So like, I mean, I lived in Singapore until recently, and there you have a very clear so-called Creole situation where you had Min speakers, Chinese Min speakers switching to using English words, but representing Min language. And so there's controversy. So he would say it's pointless to call anything a Creole because all languages go through these things, but some are kind of seem more obviously like Singlish, where it's very clearly Chinese thinking with using English words to represent Chinese way of thinking. But eventually this becomes just like any other language. But there's also language convergence, so you get the Malay forms, the English forms, and the Hokkien forms are kind of, you can line them up like in Gumpert's famous paper. You can line up the sentences word for word, and the concepts are expressed and whatnot. So this happens all over the world. And so Sally argues it's kind of pointless to say this language is a Creole and that language is not a Creole. And Troutgall actually calls the English a Creoloid because it is like a Creole, but people would get pissed off if you said it was a Creole.
Yes. Right. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I guess we would like to carry on, but actually our time is up, so we have to move on to our next speaker. And if there's anything you guys would like to discuss with Randy, we can try to do that during the break. Although I'm not sure how this is going to be realized. Maybe just sending messages to him through our chat room. And there are actually also messages in the chat room, but we don't have time for them. So so Randy just
all right, I'll take a look at them. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you, Randy. Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay.